Hello, folks. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have an epic webinar in store for you. Now, if you consider this, we've got Black Friday coming up, and you'll always have that fear at the back of your mind. Is my site going to be able to handle all of those extra people for the big sale? So we're going to have that conversation today. We're going to deep dive in with Zach Stepik, who is going to share with us how we can prepare, and we're going to grill him with your questions and some of the questions that have already been sent in advance at the end. So please be sure to let us know in the chat area any comments, any questions that you might have for Zach. And if we can fit them all in, we will try. So Zach, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm not even going to get to introduce yourself because I believe you have a story to share as well. So mate, over to you.
Welcome everybody. Today we're talking about preparing your WooCommerce site for Black Friday and Cyber Monday. As Lee said, let's just jump right in. Today, the things we're going to cover are really pretty simple, but they're remarkably important as you get into these high traffic events, especially Black Friday and Cyber Monday, which are huge. We're going to talk about why we should prepare, why performance matters. We're going to identify performance bottlenecks. We're going to talk about a newer WooCommerce feature called high performance order storage. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how the team here at Convesio can help you succeed on these massive scale events. We'll just start out with why we should prepare. And I mean, it seems to be common sense, right? That you should prepare for a massive scale event. And these massive scale events like Black Friday, they present numerous unique challenges. They both to store owners and to their tech teams. And the reason why is because they require a perfect coordination of product marketing, technology, fulfillment, and customer care. All of the gears of the business need to be running properly at the same time. I like telling stories. We're going to talk about football veterans and a Thanksgiving tragedy. So I've been telling this story for a little over a decade now, and it's actually how I got into WooCommerce performance in the first place. I got a call from my friend Noah, and he called me on Thanksgiving. I'm sitting around the table with my family at a Thanksgiving dinner, and I see this call from him, and he calls twice in a row. And nobody does that unless they really need to get a hold of you on a holiday. So the second time I answer, and he says, "Hey man, I've got a problem and I want to know if you can help." And I said, "Okay, what's going on?" He said, "Well, I was interviewed for my apparel company, Oscar Mike. I was interviewed by Jeff Joniak, the voice of the Chicago Bears, in the Chicago Bears locker room set that they used for TV. And they aired the interview during the Thanksgiving Day Chicago Bears Green Bay Packers game. And the site took a few orders and then everything crashed. Just everything. So he needed my help to get the site back up and running. And I hadn't been involved at all in the Oscar Mike site at that point. We start looking around, trying to find logins. It's on a VPS that had been very graciously donated to the foundation. Just to clarify what they do, their mission is to help injured veterans participate in adaptive sporting events. And so what they do there, they sell t-shirts, and 100% of the proceeds from the t-shirts and other things that they sell, but it all started with t-shirts, go to helping injured veterans. They take minimal expenses off the top to pay the staff, and everything else goes to helping injured veterans. So this was a big deal for them. This was the first major marketing event they had had as an organization. It aired to a lot of people. Over 1 million people were watching this. The site crashed after 14 orders. 14. So the graciously donated VPS, nobody knew how to log into it. The company that had donated it was closed because it was Thanksgiving. They did not have 24/7 support. So 4 hours later, we finally found login information. And I logged in and I started looking at what had happened. The way the server had been configured was not only handling the website, but it also had an email server installed on it that was handling the organization's entire email account for every user. When orders were being placed, 3 emails were being created. Those 3 emails, compounded by 14 orders, led to 42 things being put in the mail queue all at once, very, very quickly. And there wasn't a lot of memory between the traffic on the website and what the email server needed for the mail spool to send those emails. So it ran the server out of memory. 42 emails ran the server out of memory.
Doesn't sound a lot, does it?
No, it doesn't, but it was enough. And that mail spool caused a rolling effect where it just cascaded down. So running the server out of memory stopped the web server on the same machine from being able to deliver web pages, stopped database queries from being able to happen. Everything just died. The whole server stopped responding until it was restarted. After we restarted it and I did this analysis, we realized we had quite a few things to do. And I spent the next year and a half of my life working on site at the Oscar Mike office in Marengo, Illinois, helping them to solidify and shore up all of their technology. That is what happens when you don't prepare. He didn't have anybody ready to be able to handle that. And because of it, we don't know how many sales were lost that day. There's no way to quantify that. I say all that to say this. It is never too early to start planning for the next Black Friday, Cyber Monday. So you may be looking at this and saying, well, it's the end of August. Why are we talking about this today? And the reality is that it's never too early. I like to tell my customers to start planning for Black Friday, Cyber Monday as early as the day after Black Friday, Cyber Monday ends. Just roll into getting ready for the next one. And by doing so, you can have plenty of planning for the marketing side of things in place well before you get to Black Friday, Cyber Monday. It's a tremendous marketing effort in addition to all of the technical things that need to happen for things to go right. Let's talk a little bit about why performance matters. When you're running WooCommerce, there are some statistics you need to be aware of. And these don't just apply to Black Friday. This is a constant. Shoppers expect performance stores. This all comes from multiple studies, one performed by Amazon. A couple of research firms did studies around this. I believe one of them is from Forrester. Lots of research went into all of this, which is 47% of people expect less than 2-second page loads. So if your sites are loading in more than 2 seconds, you're providing an experience that is not what 47% of your audience expects. 57% of people just leave after 3 seconds. If they don't have anything visible after 3 seconds, they give up. Most people are not as tenacious as web developers are. Those of us who are in the industry and have been building websites or around the web for a long time will maybe hit the refresh button and see maybe if we get a response the next time. Or we'll wait because who knows what's in the way of that traffic. But the average consumer, they don't care about any of that. It's just not working. 3 seconds, they're gone. You have 3 seconds to make an impression. And this is an interesting one to combine with that. Every 1 second of page load leads to a 7% conversion loss. Just thinking about a site that does $100,000 a day in sales, a 1 second delay in page load is $2.5 million in lost sales per year. $100,000 a day in sales is an achievable target for a number of e-commerce brands. But just to provide some numbers here, even if we just cut that down by 10, to 10% of it, $10,000 a day, that's still $250,000 in lost sales. So this matters a ton. It's incredibly important. So how do we achieve this? Well, most people start looking at browser optimization. What does the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript look like? And they'll do things like install a tool like WP Rocket, which I'm a fan of, and then they'll enable compression and minification of their CSS and their JavaScript. But it goes a little beyond that. So compression, makes things smaller. Minification makes them even smaller than that. But above the fold and critical CSS is an important piece here. So the above the fold optimizations, above the fold, for those of you who don't know the term, is a term that applies to anything that is in the first visible viewport of the website. So what is visible in the browser window at the size the browser window is when the page first loads. I don't know about you, but I resize my browser windows constantly. We know this isn't a constant. This isn't something we can say every single user is going to have all of this stuff above the fold. Why is it called above the fold? Do you know, Lee? I do.
I thought it was an old print term.
It is. It is. It's from the newspaper industry. Everything that was above the first fold of the newspaper or visible when it was on the stack on the newsstand, that is what's above the fold. So we've applied that same term, the fold now being the bottom of the browser window.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Problem being everyone's got a different screen.
yeah, everybody has a different screen. Like, for example, I'm looking at a 5K screen in front of me. My presentation is on the screen of my 13-inch MacBook Pro, which is not the same resolution at all, right? So
And
just
I'm on a 2K ultra wide. We're all already different.
yeah, I mean, right here we have multiple things that are changing what the fold is for all of these devices. This is an important thing, though, because it lends into this concept of critical CSS. And critical CSS is the CSS needed to render all of that content that's above the fold. These are decisions we have to make. As designers and developers, what do we want to have load the fastest? Critical CSS, we inline into every template rather than loading it from an external CSS file. Why do we do that? Because of servers and how servers work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The other piece of browser optimization is images and other media. So if you embed a 300 megabyte MP4 file directly into your page, what do you think that's going to do for your page performance? Nobody's ever going to wait for it to load all the way. So that's why we have services that do video streaming so that we don't have to load the entire video before the page displays. Or images. You know, if you take a picture with your 46 megapixel camera of your product, and then you just upload that 12,000 pixel image directly to your website with no optimization, and that image is 114 megabytes as a JPEG, and you do that for 7 product images on a product page, most people don't have gigabit speed internet, so that's going to take forever to load. Optimizing your images and your other media matters a ton. And so you're going to want to look at tools like ShortPixel or Imagify or any of these tools that do automatic optimization of images, or better case scenario, if you're an agency and you have developers, then build image optimization into your workflow so that as you are compiling and minifying the CSS, which is part of your build process, it's also going out and locally compressing and optimizing any images that need it during the build. But Imagify, other plugins like that do a great job of doing it after the fact as well, if you don't have the luxury of having a team that can build that build process for you. That's browser optimization. So that's just one piece, right? The other piece is server performance. And what determines our server performance? We've got a few things. The biggest one, in my opinion, is the PHP version that you're running. Every new version of PHP since the revision for PHP 7 has been focused on performance. So PHP 7 was a multiple increase in performance over PHP 5.6. Big difference. And every version of PHP since has had a focus on improving performance. Why? Well, at the time that a PHP document or file is requested, the server takes that PHP and converts it into HTML. It does that by calling the database and getting data and then using server-side transformation basically through PHP to turn that data and the template that you have given it with all the PHP commands that are in it into a final HTML file. If you can run a newer version of PHP to make that process faster, do that. Now, the drawback to running newer versions of PHP sometimes is that plugin authors don't always keep pace with where technology is. So right now, for example, I believe PHP 8.2 and 8.3 even are in beta status even for WordPress itself. So until those have full release, we have a bit of a risk that we take just running those versions if we don't check our plugins to make sure they're going to work. We want to make sure that we do that, and we want to do that in a staging environment at all times. We test things in staging. We don't test in production. We don't cowboy code in production, which is the process of changing production code without testing it at all. So staging, very important. If you're a Convesio customer, we can help you get a staging environment set up for your website.
Just to interject there as well, don't do it. No matter how tempted you are. I've done it on live before and lived to regret it and not learned multiple times.
It's a risk, right?
Yeah, I think the benefit will outweigh the risk, and then I mess everything up. So yeah, never again.
I've done it. And I think all of us have, right? And the last time that I did it, I crashed a portion of a website without knowing it for almost an hour, and nobody was able to check out. So yeah, you don't want to do that. The other piece here is the HTTP protocol. So HTTP 2, HTTP 3. What is the difference between standard HTTP and HTTP 2 and HTTP 3? If you haven't noticed, since the TCP/IP world has existed, Transfer Control Protocol / Internet Protocol, that's the backbone of how the internet works from a technical perspective, right? Since that was introduced, internet speeds have changed a little bit. We no longer have to put a phone receiver onto a cradle on a 300 baud modem and listen to screeching robots in order to connect to the internet, right? That's just not a thing
Remember
anymore.
the days.
So over time, the capability of our connections have changed. HTTP in the original versions was designed to deliver very few resources at once. It would cascade over the list of resources that were needed and download them basically one at a time, maybe two at a time. HTTP 2 increased the number of resources that the server could download or send to your browser, so how much your browser could consume all at once, by an order of magnitude. HTTP 3 brings that even further. The other things that HTTP 2 and 3 required was a shift to secure sites by default. So SSL is, basically required for HTTP 2 or 3 to work. And then HTTP 3, that's the newest protocol. Luckily, something that Cloudflare supports. And if you are a Convesio customer, you have Cloudflare Enterprise support on our plans as well. So that makes sure that you are using the newest HTTP protocol and that the browser can open the fire hose further, even than HTTP 2 allowed. After that, we have object and page caching. If you've run a WordPress website for any significant portion, amount of time, you know that caching happens to make sure that we don't have to hit the server or the database for every request. Now, this is not always going to be the case, but we make sure that object and page caching works as much as possible. We cache every result we can. So object caching is caching the result from the database, and page caching is caching the result of PHP rendering the page. So that's the difference between those two. Object caching caches database queries. Page caching caches the actual PHP output into HTML. We talked a bit about transactional email and how you don't want to have your mail server on the same server as your website. So that's a big deal. We also spoke a bit about how that could go very badly for you if your server is doing both. Transactional email, though, using a transactional email service means that you are offloading all of email from your server or even your mail provider to an email service provider. There are a number of those available. There's Mailgun, there's Mandrill, which is owned by MailChimp, there's SendGrid, a whole bunch of these providers that all they do is deliver email, and they're really good at it. And so offloading that off your server and getting it out of even SMTP if possible, using a direct API connection to send the mail content to the remote service, that's your best case scenario because SMTP has overhead too. Establishing that connection and doing that takes time and effort away from other things that the server could be doing. The next piece is content delivery networks. Content delivery networks are basically a series of servers that are available on the edge. So the concept of a content delivery network uses two terms. It's origin and edge. Origin is the server that all of your content comes from originally. This is where you upload it to. And then from that origin server, things are duplicated out or cloned out to edge servers for things like CSS and images that those edge servers are physically located closer to the person requesting the page. Those things allow for for basically the ability to have those connections, those files and things come from closer to the user. And that reduces the amount of hops across the internet it takes to get that file or that document. And it makes the whole site faster, because if you try to download a file from across the ocean, remember that that file has to go through a transatlantic or trans-Pacific cable that is under the ocean in order to go across continents, across the ocean. So having an edge server that's closer to your user, especially internationally, makes a ton of sense. Also something that's just handled by default when you are using Cloudflare Enterprise with Convesio. And then the last piece here for server performance is SSL certificate negotiation and OCSP stapling. So let's get a little nerdy here if we hadn't already. When you request a web page, the first thing that your browser is going to do is make sure that if there is an SSL certificate, it inspects that certificate and then goes out and checks with the certificate authority to make sure that that certificate is valid. The certificate authority is whoever issued that certificate, whether that is a certificate you bought from, Network Solutions, or your certificate provider of choice, whoever that might be, or if it's a certificate issued by Let's Encrypt, which is the open source SSL provider that most hosts have implemented at this point. The certificate authority needs to be consulted by your browser to make sure that the certificate that's being presented is valid. That round trip generally takes 400 milliseconds on average to go out to the certificate authority, get the result back, and verify that your certificate is valid. What OCSP stapling does is it takes that certificate response from the certificate authority and it staples it to your server. And it says, for this period of time, this certificate authority response is valid. And we don't have to have every request to go and ask the CA to verify that this is right, because we already know it's right and that the expiration date is far enough out that we can just check again in a couple of weeks. And so that reduces that round trip, saves you up to 400 milliseconds of round trip time from the CA, and just handles responding at the local level. Also a feature that is part of Cloudflare Enterprise. You'll notice a trend here. OCSP stapling is huge. It's a very important piece of the puzzle of making things faster. Server performance is in multiple layers. If you've ever run a GTmetrix report or seen a Lighthouse report and looked at the waterfall of your site, you can see the SSL certificate negotiation happening. It's part of the waterfall. It's there. And it's part of that time to first byte metric. And that's the amount of time it takes to get the first byte of data back from your web server. If you're on a server with a host that has a time to first byte of over a second, maybe consider looking at another option, because you're losing a second of the 2 right away before the server even responds, right? And you still have to download resources and paint the web page into the browser, which is what happens. That's the process of visually displaying the HTML and CSS and images, is painting, right? That's what we call it. Painting the content into the browser, that takes time. So if you're losing a second right away, you only have 2 seconds, well, 1 second to make an impression, 2 seconds before people start leaving after your server has responded. Seems like a bad idea to me. And this is why shared hosting is sometimes a nightmare for people. Shared hosting, those resources are being used by as many sites as that host can fit into one machine. An environment where you have resources that are dedicated to you makes a ton of sense, especially if you're running an e-commerce site, because your hosting is your business. If you have no retail locations, you're only e-commerce, then the most important thing you can do, just like a physical retailer would, is invest in high quality real estate in which to put your store. Let's talk a little bit about how we can identify performance bottlenecks. Finding the concerns on a site, right? How do we find the things that are actually causing these performance issues that are causing me to load in more than 3 seconds? So I mentioned GTmetrix, I mentioned Lighthouse reports. Lighthouse reports are really easy to run. They're available inside the browser tools in Chrome. So if you just right click on the page and open the inspector, there's a Lighthouse tab and you can run a Lighthouse report right inside Chrome. You can also use the Google PageSpeed tool, which is backed by Lighthouse data now. And I highly recommend looking at Lighthouse at all times because Lighthouse is a very good indicator of how Google sees your web page. And anything Google is telling you is wrong is affecting your search placement. So if they're telling you something needs to be different in your Lighthouse report, just know that not remediating that, if you check it out, it's definitely a problem. Not remediating that can cause your search placement to drop in Google. So Lighthouse reports are a good starting point. GTmetrix uses a combination of technologies, both proprietary and external. It does use some Lighthouse reporting. It also, I believe, still is using YSlow in the background as well, which is a tool that predates all of these, which is the old YSlow is the old Yahoo speed tool. Lots and lots of things that can look at how your site is loading from a browser perspective. That's how we look at the front end performance. Back-end performance, we need to look at something using an APM tool or application performance monitoring. That's something like New Relic or Datadog. And what these can let us do at the simplest level is look and see where slow queries are happening in MySQL and Redis. MySQL is your database where WordPress stores its data. And in the case of WooCommerce, where it stores all of your orders, all of your products, all of your everything. Slow queries are going to affect how quickly the page builds. Kind of an important metric when you're looking at trying to hit that 2 to 3 second mark. And then you can look at methods that are called frequently or doing large processing tasks. And those methods that are called frequently can be identified. You can see how they are performing, and maybe it can identify something for you in that data that needs to be refactored from a code perspective. If it's doing large processing tasks, or if it's being called, in the case of some things in WooCommerce, millions of times a day or tens of millions of times a day, and that isn't performing well, being able to refactor those things, especially in custom code that you or your team have written or had written for you, those refactors can have a tremendous performance impact. Another tool you can use to do this that a lot of WordPress developers are familiar with is the Query Monitor plugin. It's not going to be as accurate because it can't see everything. All it knows is what WordPress knows because it sits at the WordPress layer. So it can't know how your CPU is performing. It can't know how much memory your machine has or any of those things, but it does know how much time queries are taking. The only drawback to running Query Monitor is that it inserts itself at the beginning of and end of every single query that happens on your web page. Your site will have to run Query Monitor on every query, and then it logs how long it takes, which adds another query because it has to store that somewhere, so it stores it in the database. All of that adds to the load time of your site. So that's why I have this disclaimer here. Do not leave Query Monitor on in production. It's okay to turn it on when you need it, but don't leave it on because you're hurting your site if you leave it on. Even APM tools, if you are looking at a very high traffic event and you want to maximize the amount of metal you're getting, right? The raw server power that you're getting, APM tools run as a daemon in the background that sits there and monitors all of the things that are happening on your server. That takes processing power. If you don't want the results of that to be logged, you can turn that off to get just a little more performance out of your machine, a little more throughput, more visitors before you run into a problem.
I think what we're learning here as well is literally every little helps.
Oh, yeah.
Because all of these are adding up, and if you're shaving that second, that's that 7%. That is nuts. Yep. Sorry, mate, carry on. I'm loving this.
No, it's all good, man. So the thing here is that websites die a death by 1,000 cuts, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about minor improvements, but a large number of them. If you make a large number of improvements that all increase your page speed by 100 milliseconds, well, you find 20 of those things, that's 2 seconds. So that's a huge difference. We need to find the cuts and apply some surgery to those cuts and fix them. We need to heal them. And that's what we do. We go through and we find those concerns. returns. So high performance order storage. This is the next piece we're going to talk about. I've talked about this at length. So if you've ever listened to any of the things that I do for like the Woo Dev chats that I host with Carl Alexander for Do the Woo, we've done this topic 3 or 4 different ways now because it's very important. One of the largest bottlenecks that happen in a WooCommerce store occurs when an order is placed. When an order is placed, it creates 50 pieces of post meta without high performance order storage turned on. And that's just core. That's minimum. That's no additional plugins, no extensions, nothing. Just WooCommerce itself. 50 pieces of post meta are added to every order. WordPress doesn't have a method that you can use to bulk add post meta. So it has to call the method add post meta 50 times. And add post meta creates a database query to insert a record 50 times. So that's 50 SQL queries per order. Now let's say you're getting a little bit of traffic and you have 10 orders processing a minute. That's 500 SQL queries a minute. You sustain that over 10 minutes. That's 5,000 SQL queries. You're sustaining that for an entire hour. That's 6,000 SQL queries. So let's just take that up by an order of magnitude. That was 10 orders a minute. What if you're doing 100 orders a minute? That's 60,000 SQL queries an hour. Okay. What if you're doing that every second? Every second, 100 orders a second. And so all of this matters. Utilizing the data store that was added to WooCommerce in 3.0, that's a long time ago now, that's 2017. They finally, in the last year, released functionality in WooCommerce Core called High Performance Order Storage that uses the data store and CRUD abstractions that they added back in 2017 to move orders from being in the posts table where all of the data about everything in WordPress lives. Posts, pages, products, orders, order notes, all of them, custom post types, they all live in the posts table. Every single piece of data that WordPress does, if you're doing everything the WordPress way, sits in this one table called posts and in a second table called post meta. All of those pieces being in one table, when you have millions of orders, you have millions of records, but let's say you have millions of orders and you also have hundreds of products. Those are in the same table. You also have hundreds of order notes. Oh, same table. You have tons of blog posts. Okay. Also in that same table. You have pages on your web page, also in that same table. You have some custom post types for things like news that you've had created for you. Great. Also in that same table. So when you get to millions and millions of records in that posts table, searching takes forever, inserts take forever, and it compounds. The more data that is in that table, the longer the queries take. Retrieving products, finding orders, all of these things start to take more and more time. And that's without even considering the fact that we're inserting 50 pieces of post meta with every new order. 50 pieces of post meta. Okay, we can fix that by moving orders into a custom table. And that's what high performance order storage does. It reduces the total queries for order insert by over 80%. So if you can do one thing on your WooCommerce site and get an 80% increase in performance, you probably should do that, right? And what's the most critical time in the e-commerce lifecycle? It's the time between when the person clicks place order and they get the thank you screen. And so if inserts are bogging down your database and the inserts are taking longer during the order placement, you might run into PHP timeouts because PHP is waiting for MySQL to respond and it's getting past your PHP timeout. So the thank you page never shows up. What does that cause? Well, that causes people to call you and say, hey, I placed an order, but I didn't get confirmation that my order was placed. Oh, and WooCommerce sends the emails based on getting to that step of the order process as well. So if you don't get to that thank you page, there's a possibility that those emails haven't sent either to confirm the order with the customer or sent to you to let you know you have an order to pick. All of these things matter, right? Reducing this bottleneck matters quite a bit. Now, there's a compatibility mode in high performance order storage that is the default if you turn it on. Compatibility mode actually doesn't reduce the inserts into the database because it still keeps data where it was while also putting it in the new location. So it's actually increasing the number of queries to have compatibility mode running. But it's the default because there are still plugin developers who, even though I have been yelling about this since 2017 have not updated their plugins to work with the CRUD abstractions that have been in WooCommerce since the version 3.0. What this means is there's code that they needed to change, and instead of reaching into the post meta table directly to get things out and inserting things into the post meta table directly to put them in, they have had methods available that abstract all the post meta stuff away that are related to every object type in WooCommerce: products, orders, all of the object types, right? And they've chosen since 2017 not to use those and to continue doing things a bad way. And now, because this is out, compatibility mode is required because plugin authors are still not updated. There are many who have, but this is a huge, huge thing. And I can tell you from experience, we know how huge this is because with one of our tools that we'll talk about in a little bit here, we just recently had to update for high performance order storage compatibility as well. And it hits a lot of people. It's because we're so used to just reaching into post meta and doing what we want. WooCommerce is doing things differently, but that different way is there for a reason. So we've covered a lot of technical details on why we need to prepare, how we need to prepare, what types of things we need to be aware of. As you know, you're here at a Convesio webinar. We're a hosting company. This is stuff we do well. We're more than just a hosting company, though. We're a platform for commerce. So we are specialized in the type of work that is required to run highly performant WooCommerce sites or high traffic, complex plugins, things like learning management systems, membership sites. All of these things require resourcing at a level that your simple everyday blog doesn't. And so we're really good at this stuff. That's what we do. So we do worry-free hosting for WordPress websites. Now, this is just a view of our dashboard here. You don't want to lose revenue. We have our tech is all based on flexible Docker containers. We have a load balancer. Everything loads quickly, even in high traffic periods. We will scale up the number of containers that your site has available to it if needed during a massive traffic event. We have handled giant sales. And I'm talking in the 8 and 9 figure range in days. And so knowing that speed matters, having a server infrastructure or a hosting infrastructure that automatically, elastically changes based on the needs of your site, and knowing that you can let us know you're going to send an email to 1 million people and we're going to watch things and make sure that your site stays up. That's a huge difference. Now, if you're working with a commodity hosting company, one of those people that sells cheap hosting, that hosting is a commodity. They don't like the special cases where people need more resources. That's just not what they do well. And that's what we do incredibly well. So that's the difference between most other hosts and Convesio. We also have this great console that our team developed. It gives you integration with our Cloudflare Enterprise data, so you get all the analytics that would be available in Cloudflare directly in your site dashboard. You can deploy new clusters in under a minute. It's crazy. You can keep an eye on all your key website metrics in the console. You can create, download, restore, or create new sites from a backup in a click. It makes things very easy. It's a beautiful tool. We also recently released Convesio Convert, which is our omni-channel marketing automation, segmentation, and personalization tool. Convert does all of the things that your traditional email service providers like your MailChimps or Klaviyo can do as far as email, but we also have this really advanced segmentation and personalization layer. And that personalization can be done to create things like smart pop-ups. You can do on-site personalization based on what you know about your visitor. So you can change the content of a page based on who that person is that's on the page. And this is really great when you have data from tools like WooCommerce, because you can look at what a person has purchased in the past and customize a page based on their previous purchases. So really utilizing the data you know about your customers to create a very customized experience that provides, honestly, a better, more personalized overall impression from your company to that customer. And then we have Convesio Pay, where you can reduce risk and increase revenue with a seamless payments experience. I wasn't joking when I said we were a full commerce platform, right? You can host, you can convert, and you can pay all in one platform and all with tools from one company. The reason we do this is to make sure that you have the best possible experience as a site owner or a store owner, or if you're an agency, to give you all the tools you need to support your customers in one location and to make sure that they're all integrated as much as possible to create a seamless experience. That's what I have. Lee, I know you've been monitoring the chat and we might have a few questions that have come
We
in.
do indeed. And mate, thank you. Well, first of all, just thank you for all of that. And I think my biggest takeaway before we get into those questions certainly is how so many small changes can then add up to such a significant impact. That 1 second and 7% number is the one thing that kind of hit me the most. I've
Yeah,
heard of the 2 seconds where after 2 seconds, 40 odd percent will drop.
47.
I've heard
Yeah.
of that one before, but I've never heard of the extra time, and that's huge. I've sat on my own tests, seeing a page say lasting 5 seconds. I can't do the maths, but that's at least 3 extra times 7 on top of that are of potential sales I'm going to lose. Now you
Yeah.
mentioned as well some high numbers there, say millions of orders, etc. Even if you're dealing with just a few hundred orders a month, but most people are dropping off because your site is only loading, say, in 5 seconds, etc., then that could be a significant amount of revenue lost. So for me, that was the biggest takeaway. No matter how much you're turning over, a lost sale is still a lost sale.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and again, when you did that maths as well on, say, someone turning over, say, 100K, and how much money they could be losing out on, that was nuts as well. So huge, huge takeaways. Also, folks, I want to share with you. This will also be in the show notes, description, etc. When we put the replay up, there is a link to a video that Zach and I did probably about a year ago now, back when I had a full head of hair and Zach had no gray. And and I'm joking, mate. And we talked about very specifically about WooCommerce in a lot of detail, including that high performance section there, some do's and some don'ts. I do specifically remember you saying, don't just go ahead and activate it on an existing store without checking all your plugins, etc. So Zach does deep dive in there, so go ahead and check that out as well. And if there's any other relevant podcasts that Zach's been on, I'm sure he'll share them with us after this, and we can pop them as well in the description as we go along. So, mate, one of the biggest questions, and you've already kind of answered a lot of the questions from your presentation. So as you were going through, questions were coming in, you were pretty much answering them without us having to ask them. But there are at least two, I think, that I would love to try and fit in. And the first one is there a way of testing the ability to handle huge amounts of traffic? Because it's all well and good doing all of these small things and then saying, okay, my site now loads faster, so I'm probably going to be okay. How could I test, especially for something like Black Friday, Cyber Monday?
Yeah, so the big thing here is, when you are doing a test in the manners that I've mentioned, you're testing either, if you're doing a Lighthouse test or a GT metrics test, you're testing the impact of one user. And hopefully on your Black Friday, Cyber Monday sale, you have a few more than one user on your site.
You'd hope.
So we use load testing tools.
Okay.
And these load testing tools, and everything from Grafana's K6 Cloud to, there's numerous other tools. Load Impact is one of them. The very important thing is to make sure that your test includes navigating to a product, adding a product to the cart, going to the cart page, going to the checkout page, filling out the checkout form, processing a payment, and getting to the thank you page. All of those pieces matter. So if you're testing a WooCommerce store for performance, you need to make sure that every user is going through at least a portion of that process and a percentage of them are going all the way through the process, because that's how real traffic happens on an e-commerce site. Most of these tools are scriptable in some way. You want to make sure that as many as possible are going through and hitting checkout and actually checking out, because that's where you're going to find the biggest problems. Now, what these tools do is they scale the amount amount of traffic that is going to the site over time. So they'll start out with one user, then they'll add a couple more, and then they exponentially add more users until the server stops responding.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you host with us here at Convesio, you can talk to us and have us help you with this. We will help you run a load test. We will go through and make sure that we are monitoring and that we are tweaking as things go to deliver the best possible performance. And then tools like the APM tools we were talking about, we can install those for you as well so that you can see the performance at a very deep level and see where those bottlenecks are occurring. And I recommend having those tools available during a load test like that.
That's awesome. And I mean, just on that, I've used third-party services before to do what I've thought is a test, and I've sent tons and tons of traffic to a website and thought, yeah, it can handle 10,000 people, within an hour. It's going to be fine. What I hadn't thought of doing was actually checking in that login process. People were just hitting a HTML page. You mentioned earlier, didn't you, caching? They were just hitting a cached HTML page, and your product page, if it's just a list, might just be a cached HTML page, depending on how it's set up. So that's not necessarily going to be a real life situation. What is going to happen is someone's probably going to run a search for a product. So that's going to be a PHP request and so on and so forth. Someone's going to log in. Someone's going to check out. All of these now are actual database interactions, etc. And that's the stuff that I hadn't tested for. So certainly would recommend going down this sort of track. Now, you mentioned that Convesio help. I was very surprised when I started working with Convesio way back when I had full head of hair, which wasn't true. But you folks talk in Slack. How are you able to do that? How are we able to have a conversation with the team at Convesio in such an accessible way when I'm so used to hosting companies giving me a chat bot and putting me in a queue and maybe responding to me within their SLA of so many hours or days?
Like every host, we do have an SLA, but our support happens a little different. That's because a lot of our support happens in Slack, and you as a customer have your own channel and you can raise questions in that channel. We ask that you use threads when we respond in a thread, just so that we can, very similar to a ticket, track the conversation as it goes back and forth. But it's much more real time than dealing with a normal ticketing system or even getting on the phone. The other thing that is really important that differentiates our support team is that I don't personally believe us to have a level 1 support staff. Now, and I know everybody will talk about having level 1, level 2 support leadership and all of those different tiers. And that exists to a point within our organization. But the knowledge level of all of our support staff is remarkable. I've never dealt with anybody on our support team that can't keep up with me. And that says a lot. I've learned things from our support team, and I've been doing this for a long time. I started building websites in '96. The fact that I'm still learning from our support team just tells you the quality of the support team that we have.
There you go. Well, folks, I'm afraid that is all we have time for. We've gone a little bit over. Zach, thank you so much for your time. It's been incredible. Folks, if you want to learn more, check out all of the notes on the replay. There will be links to that deep dive video, especially on the WooCommerce side of things. If you have any questions, please do get in touch with us. Again, contact information will be there, or just reply to the webinar email that you received in the first place. We're happy to answer any of those questions, happy to get involved, and happy to help prepare you for your next big large scale event. So folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Take care, and we will see you in the next webinar. Cheerio.
Bye all.